The bell above the door chimed softly as Jack Dawson stepped into Whitman's diner, his 6-year-old daughter Emily clutching his hand tightly. Outside, the small-town streets of Millbrook were just waking up, morning sunlight filtering through cottonwood trees, the air still holding a hint of last night's cool spring breeze. "Morning, Jack," called out Frank Whitman, the diner's owner, from behind the counter. He wore the same white apron he'd worn for the past 20 years, stained slightly with coffee and eggs. "Your booth's open." Jack nodded, offering a tired but genuine smile. "Thanks, Frank. We'll take the usual." Emily, quiet as always but curious, gave Frank a shy little wave before making a beeline for their regular booth, the one in the back corner, right under the window facing Main Street. She carried her sketchpad in both hands, nearly as big as her small frame. That booth wasn't just a table to them. It was their place, a small island of calm and a life that never seemed to slow down. Jack slid in across from her and loosened the collar of his flannel shirt. He worked nights at the auto shop and picked up side jobs when he could. Money was always tight. Rent, groceries, and unexpected medical bills added up faster than he liked to admit. But for this 1 hour each morning, over pancakes and hot coffee, life felt manageable. Emily opened her sketchpad, immediately putting pencil to paper. Her drawings were always the same, stick figures, swirls, and lately, more and more faces with wide, kind eyes. "What'll it be this morning, Peanut?" Jack asked with a wink. "Pancakes and apple juice?" She nodded without looking up, absorbed in her work. Frank walked over, 2 steaming mugs in hand. "I already put in her order, extra syrup on the side," he said with a chuckle, setting Jack's black coffee down. "She's got me trained better than a Labrador." Jack laughed. "You and me both." The diner hummed with its usual rhythm, silverware clinking, an old jukebox playing Patsy Cline in the corner, and the familiar creak of the front door as another customer stepped in. There was something sacred about this routine. It grounded Jack. And watching Emily doodle, legs swinging off the booth, reminded him that even in the hard years, he'd done something right. He glanced at her. She had his thick, unruly brown hair, but her eyes were something else entirely. Hazel, wide, always wondering. She'd come into his life when he least expected it, a newborn abandoned at a local church, left with only a name and a wrinkled blanket. He hadn't planned to become a father. But the moment he held her, something clicked. "Daddy," Emily said, not looking up, tapping her pencil against the table. "What did my mommy look like?" Jack froze. Outside, the morning went on as usual. But inside, something small had just shifted. Jack Dawson hadn't expected the question. Not today. Not here. He took a sip of his coffee, his hand lingering around the warm ceramic mug as he stared at Emily's curious little face. What did my mommy look like? She had asked so innocently, just like any child might. But the answer wasn't simple. It never had been. Well, he began slowly, choosing his words like stepping stones across a rushing creek. I think she must have had a kind heart. That's what I like to believe. Emily tilted her head, thoughtful. Then, without another word, she turned back to her sketchpad and began drawing again, the tip of her pencil scratching determinedly across the paper. Across the diner, the front door creaked open again. Another soft jingle of the bell overhead. Jack didn't pay much attention at first, just another customer escaping the morning chill. But Emily's pencil stopped mid-stroke. "Daddy," she whispered, eyes wide, "that lady looks sad." Jack followed her gaze. She was tall, dressed in a tailored navy coat that hugged her frame just so. Sunglasses perched on top of her head, her chestnut brown hair pulled back neatly, and yet, there was something guarded in the way she moved. As though she was carrying the weight of memories too heavy to leave at the door. She sat alone at a booth in the far corner, farthest from the window, farthest from everyone. She ordered a coffee, her voice low and even, and then folded her hands on the table, staring down at them like she wasn't sure why she'd come in at all. Jack turned back to his daughter. "Finish your drawing, kiddo." But Emily's attention stayed locked on the woman. And then, without warning, she slid from the booth. "Emily?" Jack called, startled. "Honey, where are you going?" She didn't answer. With her sketchpad tucked tightly in her arms, she walked straight toward the woman's booth, small sneakers squeaking softly across the old tile floor. Jack rose quickly, unsure whether to stop her, but something held him back. "Hi," Emily said, standing beside the woman's table. "Are you my mommy?" The diner went still. Even the jukebox seemed to quiet. The woman looked up slowly, her mouth slightly open, a breath caught in her throat. She stared at Emily, something flashing behind her eyes, shock, confusion, maybe even recognition. Jack stepped forward, kneeling gently beside his daughter. "I'm so sorry," he said to the woman, his voice tight with emotion. She sometimes lets her imagination run wild. But the woman didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on Emily, softening. "No," she said quietly. "It's quite all right." She looked down at the sketchpad Emily still held out, a drawing of a woman's face, wide eyes, a gentle smile. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Jack gently led Emily back to their booth. She didn't resist, just looked back over her shoulder once, quietly. The woman stayed seated, her coffee untouched. But her fingers now trembled slightly as they circled the rim of the cup. And in the warm hum of Whitman's diner, something invisible had shifted. Margaret Maggie Blake hadn't planned to stop at Whitman's diner that morning. In truth, she rarely visited places like it anymore, small-town cafes with worn leather booths and the scent of bacon permanently baked into the walls. But something about this place had pulled her in. And now she sat frozen, the faint warmth of her coffee long gone cold, replaying that little girl's question over and over again in her mind. "Are you my mommy?" The words had struck like a tremor, small but impossible to ignore. Maggie's life had been meticulously curated, every day scheduled, every emotion compartmentalized. Her world ran on quarterly earnings, private drivers, and security gates. But nothing, not years of therapy, not champagne-fueled galas, had ever pierced her so directly. Across the room, the man, Jack, was gently brushing the child's hair behind her ear, speaking to her in that steady, loving tone only a parent could master. Maggie watched them quietly, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. There was a simplicity to their interaction that she hadn't seen in years. No pretense. No performance. Just love. Top off? Frank Whitman's voice broke gently into her thoughts. He stood beside her with the coffee pot, brows raised. Maggie glanced up, startled. "Oh, no, thank you," she murmured, then added after a beat, "She's a sweet little girl." Frank smiled knowingly, his eyes drifting toward the booth by the window. "That's Emily. Been coming here with her dad for years." "She's not his by blood, is she?" Maggie asked softly, immediately second-guessing the boldness of her question. Frank didn't seem fazed. He just gave a slow, respectful nod. "No. Adopted her when she was just a baby. Folks say he found her outside a church one snowy night. Took her in without a second thought. Raised her like his own ever since." Maggie swallowed hard. How old is she? 6, Frank replied. Funny little thing, always drawing women's faces lately. Said to me once she dreams about a lady with kind eyes. He looked at Maggie meaningfully. Kids feel things we adults forget how to see. Maggie managed a tight smile, but her chest ached. She stood slowly, placing a 20 on the table, far more than the price of her untouched coffee. Before leaving, she allowed herself one last glance toward the child. Emily was back to drawing, her brow furrowed in concentration. As if nothing extraordinary had just happened. Outside, Maggie stood on the sidewalk and took in the town's quiet hum, the sound of tires rolling over brick-paved streets, a flag snapping in the breeze, birds flitting from one rooftop to the next. She hadn't thought about Hannah in years. Her daughter. Her baby. Born in secret, taken away before Maggie had even left the hospital. Her wealthy, powerful parents had seen to that. There were no photos. No letters. No trace. Until now. And for the first time in decades, Maggie Blake wasn't sure she could keep the past buried any longer. The next morning arrived quietly, sunlight casting soft golden beams across Jack Dawson's small kitchen, where the scent of fresh coffee mingled with the faintest hint of maple syrup from Emily's favorite toaster waffles. Outside, the usual sounds drifted in, delivery trucks rumbling past, a lawnmower starting a few houses down, wind chimes swaying gently on the porch. Jack leaned on the counter, cradling his mug, watching his daughter at the table. Emily sat with her legs swinging rhythmically beneath the chair, her sketchpad open and crayons scattered like wildflowers across the table. She was drawing again, faces, mostly. Always women. Always those same wide, kind eyes. His chest tightened. Yesterday's moment at the diner still lingered like a shadow. That stranger, Maggie, he'd later overheard someone call her, had barely said a word. But there'd been something unmistakable in the way she looked at Emily. Something raw. Unspoken. "Daddy," Emily said suddenly, without looking up, "why did she look like the lady in my dream?" Jack blinked. "What lady, sweetheart?" "The one I see sometimes when I sleep," Emily said, her voice soft. "She's smiling at me. She has pretty hair, and eyes like warm honey." He set down his coffee and crouched beside her. "You've been dreaming about her?" Emily nodded. "Since I was 5. But this time, she was real." Jack searched for the right words, something comforting, grounded. "Dreams can feel real sometimes. Maybe your imagination is just really good." But his own voice didn't convince him. Her drawing was nearly finished. It was a woman's face again, but this time, there was more detail, dark hair pulled back neatly, pearl earrings, and those same soft eyes. It was her. Maggie. Jack studied it, stunned by the resemblance. Coincidence, he told himself. Kids latch onto images. But still, a sliver of unease threaded through his thoughts. Could there be more to this? Later that morning, as they stepped into Whitman's diner again, Jack found himself scanning the room instinctively. The booth in the far corner was empty. Maggie wasn't there. "Not today," Frank Whitman murmured from behind the counter, handing Jack a fresh mug of coffee as he passed. "Figured you might be wondering." Jack gave a small nod. "Just curious, I guess." Emily climbed into their usual seat, flipping open her sketchpad with focus. She acted like nothing had happened. But Jack knew better. Kids noticed things adults missed. Felt things deeper than they let on. He sat across from her, the clink of dishes and distant hum of the jukebox filling the space between them. But his thoughts stayed fixed on that woman. On Emily's dreams. on the truth he'd never been able to give her. Across town, in a sleek penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the skyline, Maggie Blake stood with her back to the glass. In her hands, she held a leather-bound photo album, long buried in the back of a closet. And there, pressed between two yellowed pages, was a photograph of a baby swaddled in pink. Her daughter, Grace. And for the first time in years, Maggie let the tears come. The sky over Millbrook was painted in soft gray as clouds rolled in from the west, promising rain by evening. Jack Dawson pulled his truck into the lot behind Whitman's diner, parking beneath the flickering sign that had become a familiar comfort. Emily hopped out, her ever-present sketchpad tucked under her arm like it held the secrets of the universe. Jack's steps felt heavier today. There was a pressure in his chest he couldn't shake. Inside, the diner buzzed with its usual morning rhythm, clattering dishes, the hiss of bacon on the griddle, and Patsy Cline playing softly from the jukebox. Frank gave them the usual nod as they slid into their booth. "Coffee's coming," Frank called. "Emily's usual too." "Thanks," Jack replied absently. Emily was already drawing, tongue tucked into the corner of her mouth in concentration. Jack stared at her for a long moment, the little girl who had become his entire world. He thought about her questions, her dreams. And that woman, Maggie. He hadn't planned to ask. He told himself the past didn't matter. But something had changed. Emily deserved answers. Jack stood and walked to the counter, where Frank was refilling a sugar jar. "Hey Frank," Jack said in a low voice, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Emily was still occupied. "You ever heard of a woman named Margaret Blake?" Frank looked up, brows raising slightly. "Maggie Blake?" Jack nodded. "Sure. Big name out of Chicago. Used to be in investment banking or something fancy. Owns that old lake house outside town. Folks say she comes around now and then, but never stays long." "Why?" Jack hesitated. "You think she'd ever have a reason to come back for good?" Frank studied him for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly with concern. "Jack, is this about Emily?" Jack didn't answer directly. "She keeps dreaming about her. Draws her face like she's known her forever. I can't explain it." Frank paused. Then, in his usual quiet way, he said, "You know, there's a guy I used to work with, Tom Reynolds. Used to be a detective before he retired. Good man. Knows his way around county records. Maybe he can help fill in the blanks." Jack nodded slowly. "Would you ask him for me?" "I already did," Frank replied with a faint smile. "He's meeting you here tomorrow morning." Back at the booth, Emily looked up, eyes bright. "Daddy, can we draw together later?" Jack smiled, his heart full and aching all at once. "Yeah, sweetheart. I'd like that." Later that day, in her penthouse apartment, Maggie stood at her window watching raindrops trace lines down the glass. Her assistant's calls went unanswered. Her inbox remained untouched. Her mind kept drifting back to a sketch, one she didn't even own. A little girl's drawing of her face. She didn't believe in signs. But something about that morning, that child, it felt like something lost was finding its way home. The rain had passed by morning, leaving behind dew-covered sidewalks and the scent of wet earth drifting through open windows. Whitman's diner glowed softly against the overcast sky, its neon sign blinking like a familiar lighthouse for the early risers of Millbrook. Jack Dawson sat at their usual booth with Emily, who was happily working on a new drawing, this time, the outside of the diner, complete with a waving Frank in the doorway. Jack's coffee sat untouched, his thoughts somewhere far from breakfast. Across the room, a man in his 60s with a sturdy frame and a neatly trimmed silver beard nursed a mug of black coffee. When Frank gave Jack the nod, Jack stood and walked over. "Tom Reynolds," the man said, rising and shaking Jack's hand with a grip that spoke of years in law enforcement. "Frank filled me in. Said you're looking for a few answers." Jack nodded. "I don't know how much help I'll be. I adopted Emily through the county 6 years ago. Her birth mother was listed as Grace Blake, but everything else was sealed." Tom pulled out a small leather notebook and clicked a pen. "Do you remember the agency name? Hospital? Any dates?" Jack provided what little he could. "Emily's birth date. The county. The church where she was found." Tom took it all down without judgment, just quiet focus. "You're not looking for trouble, are you?" Tom asked, not unkindly. Jack shook his head. "No. Just truth. For her. She's starting to ask questions I don't know how to answer." Tom nodded once. "Give me a few days. These old records don't always live in databases." Back at the booth, Emily showed Jack her latest sketch, a picture of the three of them, herself, Jack, and Maggie Blake, all standing under a tree with big smiles. Jack's breath caught. "Why Maggie again?" he asked gently. Emily shrugged. "Because she belongs with us. I just know." That same morning, Maggie Blake stood at the bookshelf in her penthouse, holding a photo she rarely allowed herself to look at. It was old, creased at the corners. In it, a teenage version of herself sat in a hospital bed, cradling a newborn wrapped in a pink blanket. The baby's name, she had whispered quietly back then, was Grace. She'd never spoken the name again. Her parents had forbidden it. Arrangements were made swiftly. Closed adoption. No details. And Maggie had been forced to resume her life as if none of it had happened. But now, a little girl with the same eyes as Grace had called her mommy. Maggie's fingers trembled around the frame. She didn't know how, or even if, it was possible. But something inside her told her it was time to stop running. Time to turn toward the past, and maybe, just maybe, toward something more. The storm arrived like a whisper and stayed like a song, gentle rain tapping the windows of Whitman's diner, a distant rumble of thunder reminding Millbrook that spring hadn't yet finished its work. Inside, the warmth of coffee and the scent of buttermilk pancakes wrapped around Jack, Emily, and Maggie like a soft blanket. It had been 3 days since Detective Tom Reynolds gave Jack the answer he didn't expect, but somehow already knew. Emily's birth mother had been Grace Blake. Grace. Jack remembered the name clearly from the sparse documents he'd once seen. But now, with Tom's help, he had confirmation and a connection that felt impossible to ignore. Grace was Maggie's daughter. Maggie sat across from him in the diner now, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea. She wasn't the polished executive today. Her makeup was softer, her coat a simple wool blend, and her expression far less guarded than the first day they met. "I didn't know what became of her," Maggie said quietly, watching Emily doodle at the far end of the booth. "My parents, they handled everything. They told me it was best to forget. I tried." Jack nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Grace died shortly after giving birth. She left Emily at the steps of a church wrapped in a pink blanket and a name pinned to her. Maggie's breath hitched. "She named her?" "Emily Grace," Jack said. "I kept it." Maggie looked away, blinking fast. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "I missed it all. Her first breath. Her first steps. Her first smile. She swallowed hard. But maybe. I don't have to miss everything. Jack was quiet for a moment, watching Emily draw a house with big windows, tall trees, and 3 figures standing together out front. She already sees you as someone important, he said. She asked if we could all be together. Like a family. Maggie gave a soft, disbelieving laugh. Children are brave like that. They see the world as it could be. The bell over the door jingled, but no one turned to look. The storm outside had softened to a drizzle, the streets glistening in the gray morning light. Inside the diner, the world felt still, held gently between grief and grace. Emily slid over to Maggie's side and leaned against her. Without thinking, Maggie put an arm around her small shoulders. It was tentative at first, like someone picking up a memory too fragile to hold, but then it became natural. Solid. Real. Jack watched them silently, his chest tightening with something close to peace. No one said it aloud, but all 3 felt it, a quiet beginning forming beneath the ashes of loss and years of unanswered questions. Maybe they weren't a conventional family. Maybe life had stitched their hearts together in ways they never expected. But here, in a corner booth on a rainy morning, a father, a child, and a long-lost grandmother had begun to heal. Together. It was the kind of spring afternoon that made you want to roll the windows down and breathe deep. Sunshine spilled across the sidewalks of Millbrook, dappling the porch swings and tulip beds with soft golden light. The air smelled faintly of lilacs, cut grass, and something that felt like possibility. Jack Dawson stood on the front walk of a modest 2-bedroom home tucked near the edge of town. It wasn't much, a small porch, a patchy lawn, but it was theirs. He watched as Emily skipped ahead down the driveway, waving a folded piece of paper in her hand. "Grandma Maggie's here," she shouted joyfully. Maggie Blake leaned against her car parked by the curb. She wore jeans and a chambray shirt, her sunglasses perched atop her head. It was the first time Jack had ever seen her look entirely at ease. The tension that once marked her every movement had softened, replaced by something far simpler. Emily ran to her and pressed the drawing into Maggie's hands. "It's us," she said proudly. "Me, Daddy, and you. In front of our house." Maggie opened it slowly. 3 figures were drawn with care, standing beneath a wide tree with hearts floating overhead. At the bottom, Emily had written in big, careful letters, "Our family." Maggie blinked quickly. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Jack joined them, smiling gently as he glanced over Maggie's shoulder. "She's been working on that all week." "I think," Maggie said, her voice a little shaky, "it's the first time I've ever felt like I belonged somewhere." They drove out to the old lake house that afternoon, a place Maggie had once inherited but never returned to. The gravel drive wound through tall pine trees, the scent of damp bark and blooming dogwoods lingering in the air. Emily raced ahead to the dock, pointing out the birds skimming across the surface of the water. "Can we come here again?" she asked. "Maybe even stay sometimes?" Maggie glanced at Jack, uncertainty flickering for just a second before she replied, "Yes. I think that would be nice." Inside, the house still held the past in its bones, old furniture covered in sheets, books on dusty shelves, photo frames waiting to be filled. But the moment they stepped in together, it felt different. Alive. Later, as the sun dipped low behind the lake and cast long shadows across the porch, the 3 of them sat together, Jack on the porch swing, Maggie beside him, and Emily curled between them, her head resting against Maggie's arm. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence held more than words could carry, a shared understanding that somehow, After everything, they had become something whole. A family not born of convention or planning, but of chance, courage, and a child who saw love before anyone else could. And as the stars began to twinkle above the pine tops and the evening breeze whispered through the screen door, Jack reached for Maggie's hand. She didn't pull away. Not anymore. Some of the most profound changes in life arrive not with grand announcements, but in quiet moments: a child's question, a stranger's glance, a cup of coffee shared in silence. The story of Jack, Emily, and Maggie reminds us that life has a way of rewriting itself when we least expect it, often in the soft spaces where love quietly takes root. For older adults, those who have weathered seasons of loss, regret, or paths not taken, this story speaks to something deeply human: the need for connection, for healing, and for the hope that it's never too late to begin again. Jack, a man who had no intention of becoming a father, opened his heart to a child in need. Maggie, once hardened by years of success and solitude, found her way back to the family she thought she had lost forever. And little Emily, through her innocence and unwavering belief in love, became the bridge that brought two broken hearts home. The lesson here is both simple and profound. Family is not always defined by blood, but by love, choice, and presence. At any age, we are capable of giving and receiving love. No matter how long we've carried grief or how far we've run from our past, there is still room for redemption. Forgiveness, of others, of ourselves, is another quiet theme woven into the story. Maggie could have remained trapped in guilt. Jack could have hidden from the truth. But instead, they faced it with courage. And in doing so, they opened the door to something greater: peace. As we grow older, it can be tempting to believe that the chapters of deep transformation are behind us. But perhaps the real gift of aging is the wisdom to recognize that life still offers unexpected beauty, sometimes through the hands of a child, a conversation at a diner, or the courage to open your heart once more. This story reminds us to stay open, to make space for the unexpected, and to remember that the greatest joys in life often come when we stop guarding our hearts and start listening to them. Because sometimes, healing doesn't come in a hospital or a therapist's office. Sometimes, it arrives at a small-town diner, with pancakes, drawings, and a second cup of coffee.